In this tutorial we are going to see how to create a new survey with Arena. When you want to create a new survey, you can go to the top right corner and select new survey. Then you will have to specify a name for your survey. The name must be unique, so try to write it in a way that it will be unique. For example, you can add the date or your name to the survey name, something like this. Now let's press this button, create survey, to create the survey. If you want, you can specify the default language for the survey, but in our case we will do it in English. Press this button, create survey, and the survey will be created. You will be prompted to specify some basic information about the survey. You can do it from here by pressing the edit info icon, or this other button is the same. Then once you have defined this basic information, you will have to define what are the attributes in your survey by going to the form designer. Now let's go to the edit info section. Here you can type for example the name for your survey and type in something like this. Later on we will see all these other options, but now let's keep this one simpler. Save the information. Now let's go back to the home section. If you want, you can collapse or expand this sidebar. I'm keeping it collapsed just to save some space. In our home section is mostly empty, but if you want, later on we will see some other information. Let's go to the form designer. You can do it from here, from the form designer section, or you can do it by clicking this link in the middle of the screen. Now the survey, as you see, our form is mostly empty, and we will go into we will add some attributes. The survey that we are going to create in this test will be a very simple biophysical survey with a structure, a cluster, plot, and a list of trees inside every plot. In this sample survey, there will be several plots that the user can insert inside the same cluster, and then for every plot there will be a list of trees that the user will access in the field. When you want to rename the root entity, click this edit icon that you have in the top bar. You see, root entity is the entity that we have on top that will wrap everything. In our case is the cluster, so let's rename it. Click that icon and rename it into cluster. For every attribute or entity in the editor, you have a name, label, and description. These are the three things that you always have in the editor, in the attribute editor. Name must be considered like an identifier, an internal name, so it must respect some rules that you can find in the OpenForest website. But in general it must be all lowercase. It's preferable to have an English name, just because if someone else is going to use this survey or to analyze the data using this survey, will understand what is this attribute for, the topic, and so on. And try to keep it shorter, because it's an internal name, will be used in the data export. So if the name is shorter, it will be better, basically. In the label, instead, you can write whatever you want. You can use special characters, uppercase, lowercase letters, spaces, and if you have another language with special characters, I don't know, like Arabic or whatever it is, you can also use that characters in the label. Instead, you cannot use special characters in the name. Let's save and go back. Now we have renamed the cluster, the root entity. Let's add now a key attribute for the cluster. We will do it as an integer, just to keep it simple. Let's see later how to make it more complex. Let's create an integer attribute for the cluster, number, and we will call it cluster number. Cluster no simply. The label, I can write something like this. We will mark it as a key attribute. Key attribute, that means this one will identify the entire cluster. So the user cannot insert 2 times the same cluster with the same number, with the same cluster number. Let's add now some other attribute. For example, we can add an attribute that says if the cluster is accessible or not. In order to do this, we will create a coded attribute. So let's press the add button here and select code as type of attribute. As you see, you have here a list of possible type of attributes. Now during this tutorial we are going to see mostly all these attributes. Let's create a code attribute for this accessibility. We will call it cluster accessibility. Sorry. Label can be simpler, we can just call it accessibility. The name must be unique, so this is why I'm adding a prefix cluster accessibility, because later on we will add another attribute for the plot accessibility, for example. In that case, that one will be called plot accessibility and this one cluster accessibility, so we won't make confusion between the two. Category, let's create a new category to store the values, the possible values that the user can select. I'm going to call this category accessibility, and let's add some values. When you want to add a new value, just press the add icon that you have on top. You have to specify an internal code for each item. In our case, let's start from 0 for the accessible state, let's say. Description it's to add a kind of tooltip that will be shown to the user to give some more hint about the item that the user is selecting. Now let's add another item, for example item 1 for inaccessible, and you can say inaccessible for some reason, for example because there is a slope. Let's add another item again, let's give it number 2, inaccessible, because for example there is a private land or something like this. And let's create a new item for whatever other reason the user wants to specify. In these cases usually we use a code like this, like 90 or 99, just because if in the future you want to add some other option, the option 99 with other reasons or whatever it is, where the user can specify another option that is not listed, will always be at the end of the list, so you won't break the ordering of the codes. So let's create this one with code 99 and let's call it other reasons. Okay, so this is our first category that we have created. It will be automatically assigned to the attributes that we are creating. If you want to change this category, you can press the edit button that you have close to the category selector, and you will go back to this editor. Or if you want, you can go in the categories and check the list of categories there. But now let's first save this attribute. Whenever you do some changes to an attribute, don't forget to save using the buttons that you have below. Otherwise you can navigate somewhere else and forget to save. You will lose the changes that you have that you have done to the attribute. Here, for every type of attribute, you have different properties that you can specify. In this case, since it's a code attribute, I can specify the display type, basically if it's a drop down or a checkbox. Usually when you have a big list of values, it's preferable to select drop down. Instead, when you have few items, you can select checkbox. All the possible options will appear to the user. It will be simpler for the user to select the value. Show code means that you want to show also the internal code that we have assigned for every item in the category. Usually it's not nice to see the internal code, so it will be better to hide these internal codes unless the users are used to find the items using the codes. Anyway, let's save and go back to the form designer. Once in a while, if you want to do a preview of your survey and check that everything works, press the preview button that you have on top. This preview will show the data entry form as the data entry user will see. So this is our accessibility field that we have just created, where the user can select a value from a list, and this is the cluster number as an integer. When you have done, close the preview using this close preview button. Okay, now let's create another attribute. For example, for the location, this will be a coordinate attribute. Let's press the plus icon that you have here and select coordinate, because it's a special type of attribute that is used to store coordinates. Let's create this coordinate, give it a name cluster location, for example. As label I can just write location. Later we will see these other options. Now let's save and go back to the form. And now we're going to see how to create a very simple table inside the cluster. So if you want to create a table, you have to go here in the plus button on top and select the last option, that is table or form. Now I want to create a table for the cluster time study that will record the date and time when the user started to access this cluster. So for example, when the user started one day and a certain time, finished another time, and then he continued to work on the same cluster the day after, from time to time. So let's specify the name of this entity. This will be cluster time study. I'm copying this because I will use this prefix for the attributes that I'm inserting inside the cluster time study. Label, I'll keep it shorter like this, time study. Display as table. Later we'll see other type of options, but now let's keep it like this. Save and go back. This is our time study table. You see Arena, it's warning you because we have to specify at least one child item and at least a key attribute for this entity. If you want to resize it a bit, you can use this arrow, this icon that you have in the bottom right corner. Now let's create the other attributes. That will be the date, start time, and end time. If you want to create a new attribute inside the table, press the plus icon that you have here. We will select date for the date. This will be time study date. Label can be simply date. And now I'm going to mark this date as a key attribute for the time study, because I don't want the user to insert two times the same two rows with the same date in the time study. Let's save and go back. This is just an example. This is just an example of I will explain you how to create tables, attributes, and things like this. In your survey, depending on the context of your survey, you will have something different, but now we don't care much. Just keep it as just as an example. Now I'm going to add a new attribute of time. Here it is, the start time. In the label I'll keep it simpler. I'll put in start time. Okay. And now I'm going to add another attribute, type time, for the end time. End time. Okay. The label will be simply end time. Okay. These are this is our first table. Maybe I can also enlarge it a bit. This is fine like this. If you want, you can do a preview to check that everything works fine. When you want to add a new row to a table, press the add icon that you have on top. For the date, you can select the date from the calendar, or you can type the date in this input field. Time, you can select the time from this time picker. Okay, and that's it. You see, since we have marked the date as a key attribute, we cannot type 2 times the same date, otherwise Arena will complain, but we have to select 2 different dates. Okay. Later on we will see how to add some validation rule that prevents that, for example, the user inserts an end time that is lower than the start time. But now let's close this preview. Let's add the last attribute in this cluster form. That will be the cluster remarks. For the cluster remarks, I'm going to add a new attribute of type text. As you see, when you want to add a new attribute inside the cluster, you have to use this plus icon that you have in the top right corner of the cluster form. Instead, when you want to add a new attribute in the time study or in another table, you have to use the plus icon that is in the top right corner of the table, of the time study table. Okay, but now let's add a text attribute inside the cluster. Here you have a confirmation that you are adding something to the cluster, so double check that you're adding things in the right place. I'm selecting text and I'm going to call this one cluster remarks. It's just remarks, multi-line. Save and go back. You see, since I'm added it as a multi-line text field, I will see it as a text area quite big, where the user can insert more information. Okay, once in a while do this preview. You see, the user can type whatever they want. It works pretty well. This is our first form. Now we are going to see how to create another form, a plot form inside each cluster.